Hello. Today is Wednesday, June 9th, 2021. My name is Colin Goldberg, and I'm here today with artist Paul D. Miller, aka DJ Spooky, that's Subliminal Kid. So welcome, Paul. Thanks so much for joining us. And why don't we jump right in? So usually, I kind of just open up with general question about, if you want to tell us a little bit about your background, like where you were born, where you live and practice now, and any cultural influences that you'd like to bring up.
Okay, so let's just dive in. First and foremost, just want to say thank you for inviting me on your show. It's always a pleasure. And Colin, it's been real, interesting to get a chance to see the evolution of what you're doing with this whole Techspression scenario. All right, so for folks out in the audience, what's up? My name's Paul Miller, aka DJ Spooky. All right, so I'm from Washington, D.C. I grew up near DuPont Circle. But also grew up in another area called Shepherd Park, up in an area called Northwest near Silver Spring. Anybody who knows those regions, they're very different. DuPont Circle is where all the embassies are. It's a very beautiful area. My mom had a store called Toast and Strawberries that was at Connecticut Avenue and R Street. It's a beautiful area, lots of major buildings and very, just elegant area. Shepherd Park was a little more residential, and I grew up in a pleasant, relaxed, middle-class household. Both my parents were professors. My mom was a historian of design who taught occasionally at Howard University, and my father was dean of Howard University's law school. So both parents were, I grew up in a household that viewed social change as a distinct relationship to education and creating a notion that the politics of change is founded on research, intense discussion of ideas, and sort of stress testing ideas, and art and poetry and things like that. So I grew up, in a household where we had a robust debate about information at every level all the time. And I really feel that informs my current read. I kind of have like a deep allergic reaction to a lot of music is just straight up knucklehead stuff. So, you just want to ask people what are you thinking? Why are you doing, stuff like that. Long story. So that Socratic notion of asking questions about things all the time, that's kind of my role.
Gotcha. I could definitely relate to that. My parents were both professors as well in the sciences, but certainly was brought up in a similar fashion, I think, in some ways to, ask questions. And also, there was sort of a strong sort of impression made on me about the validity of the scientific method, even though the results change through time. So that definitely, I feel is something that we have in common, is that sort of upbringing with an emphasis on education. And that's really interesting. So in terms of where you your evolution as an artist, can you talk a little bit about that? I think you mentioned when we were speaking earlier that your studies in school weren't necessarily in music, and you kind of got into it because you really just enjoyed it. Or can you talk a little bit about that evolution?
Yeah, absolutely. The eerie thing about information is it's the foundation and building blocks of everything. And I love the fact that both your parents are professors, but you're also into art and you're into music. I think we have a lot of overlap of interest there. How we think about the arts is that the creative mind, the human being, is always making inquiries into the world around itself. The brain is fascinating. Like a lot of quantum physics people actually, like Schrodinger's paradox or Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Those are things where when you perceive something, you change it. Down to the subatomic and quantum level, there's fascinating studies that show that human beings and the brain, the architecture of the mind, actually informs its relationship to the universe. So amusingly and strangely enough, music is the pattern that we speak to the universe, to ourselves, to the world around us. I've always been a huge Sun Ra fan, and I'm a big fan of the way that certain avant-garde musicians like Sun Ra, John Cage, Ornette Coleman, and so on, made inquiries into the notion that jazz and the African-American experience informed radical change in America. And then on the other end of the spectrum, hip hop, techno, dubstep, all the current electronic music, a lot of people tend to forget that the legacy is that it's an African American diaspora of erasure. So how your culture suffers, whether you're Jewish, you have a diaspora. If you're African American, you have a diaspora. All of those things are a kind of a struggle to recollect the fragments of culture. When I say the struggle, music, for example, polyphony, polytonality, all of these polyrhythms, those come out of the legacy of the African American collision with European aesthetics, that the slave trade and the migration north after the Civil War and things like Reconstruction, those influenced all aspects of African American culture and life. I'm a globalist, I'm an avant-gardist. I firmly believe in cross-cultural communication at every level. So, how I think about art and my philosophy of design and things like that, everything you're just talking about, it's kind of like we're kind of in a very dark moment, very cynical moment post-Trump. I still am shocked that this dude was in office. But politically speaking, we're now in like Jim Crow 2.0, where all of these kind of new voter suppression laws and Republicans using stuff like QAnon and algorithmic manipulation, what you call computational propaganda. How do we give people antibodies to this sort of pandemic of misinformation? And I think music and the arts are a critical role in giving people better tools for critical thinking. That's kind of my foundation, I think. I really like to push people, and it pisses people off, but so be it. Mm-hmm.
So, I know in doing a little bit of research on your background, I was reading about, the sort of idea of constructed identity, and I'm interested to sort of hear the origin story behind DJ Spooky. Like, where did that come from, and when did Paul become DJ Spooky, and how did that happen?
Okay, so I went to a very small college called Bowdoin College in Maine, but also when I was younger, I went to a Quaker school, Friends Seminary. I also went to Woodrow Wilson, which is a public school, and I also went to some boarding schools, which I'll leave those out. But education has always been something I'm very interested in. When I was younger, I was a little bit more of a nerd, still am. I read voraciously every day, all the time. I'm reading. I would say college was a kind of a foundational moment, mainly because I was presented with a situation where I was really into certain aspects of electronic music and was very interested in philosophy. And I was also majoring in macroeconomics. And macroeconomics is the study of human behaviors as they engage the marketplace, as they engage this notion of what economists call gross domestic product, GDP, growth. All of these things are aspects of what you would call quality of life. Philosophy, as Socrates or Plato would say, makes a life worth living. The problem in our time is that we're facing a climate crisis. We're facing a kind of a political crisis, and these have been ongoing democracy. And and to me, sampling a collage is kind of like time travel. You're always playing with these ideas of possibilities of permutations of time. And a sample is a fragment, a chronotype. Some people would call it, instead of archetype. Chronotype is kind of like a collage of many different temporal dimensions. So you take a record from 1930, you take a record from 1975, you throw in a baseline from 2022, and you have dubstep, or et cetera, et cetera. And that kind of collage is very related to the literary movement of the beat poets in the 1950s, people like William S. Burroughs, Jack Kerouac, and of course, above all for me, Amiri Baraka, who I had the pleasure and honor to meet years ago. And we did a DJ with him reading poems of this sort of, and also relate extensively. And in fact, I took my DJ name from William S. Burroughs. So, that kind of idea of using sound as an acoustic and acoustically for this pandemic of misinformation. These are things that I'm kind of thinking about right now. Are you?
Gotcha. Gotcha.
I can see some wheels processing.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. So, you know, I know that you know, you're primarily known for your work as a musician, you know, but I'm also very interested in kind of like your background, you know, with regards to the interdisciplinary work, some, you know, visual projects. I know that actually yesterday in our Techspressionist salon, one of the artists who presented, an artist by the name of Greg Little, who's one of my graduate advisors, mentioned that he was actually in a show that you had curated. I believe it was called the Invisible App. And so like, I didn't even know that, you know, you had been involved in curatorial projects like that. So I'd be interested to sort of hear, you know, about how you see, you know, how you sort of see yourself as an artist, you know, from a holistic standpoint, that is, you know, how those pieces all sort of fit together, if they do, or, you know, how you sort of see that.
Okay, so let's unpack a couple of issues. All right, so I'm a musician, an artist, and a writer. So when I first moved to New York, I lived in Paris for a couple of years. I moved to New York after that, you know, typical 20s stuff. When I was in my 20s, I moved back to New York in the late 90s, around 97.
We were actually like around the corner from each other. I found out later, right? I was on A in second, and you were on, I think, B in second, right? Or you had a spot that were there?
Yeah, Avenue B and Second Street. And there was a club called Save the Robots. There was a place called the Garage, or the gas station. And so I would throw parties in the gas station that were related to contemporary art mixed with music. And a lot of artists started coming to those parties. You know, it's always a happy accident that music took over, because I was very focused on gearing up to go back to graduate school and to get a degree in mostly dealing with foreign policy and macroeconomics. And so I had taken 2 years off and was having a great time in Paris. I have to admit, it was wild, it was fun, you know, just a whole new different dimension of freedom. And you know, I ended up working and hanging out in Paris, DJing, but then also was meeting people at the Shakespeare bookstore in Paris. When I moved to New York, it was the world was a lot more flexible about electronic music, and you had downtown people doing art rock. Like I met Thurston Moore from Sonic Youth, Yoko Ono. A lot of people were much more freewheeling. And I think downtown culture's always had that sensibility that it's a mix. Nowadays, it seems like the world is a lot more segregated, a lot more genre specific, and a lot more like somebody's Spotify playlist has like segmented reality itself. You know, like if you like, you know, and you have a recommendation engine all the time going, if you like this song, you'll like this song, but you're never going to hear anything new because you're only dealing with an algorithm that's built an acoustic and algorithmic portrait of you. And it's just feeding you crap over and over and over.
People like the news.
Yeah, people
or the
are
way
just
media
not
is.
that adventurous. Yeah, everything is algorithmically driven now. In fact, that's the current book I'm working on. So when you think about it, the 90s was when a lot of the stuff, the experimentation, checking out different styles, moving around, going to different events that had different styles and flavors and so on. People they really are now very genre specific, and which is a tragedy of our time, actually, I think. So I write books as well. Most of my books are with MIT Press. I've been publishing with them for a long time. The current book I'm working on is called Digital Fictions, The Future of Storytelling. My previous books were dealing with sound, technology, and art. There's a bunch of them. If anybody is so motivated, you can go to djspooky.com/books, and they're all there. The most well-known book I did is I went to Antarctica with a studio and a backpack, so to speak. And I basically wanted to do, I'm fascinated with this idea of acoustic portraits. So how we think about sound is generally this intangible and invisible situation. Some people use sound for mental, you know, like meditation, for example, like Buddhist monks. Some people use sound for physical celebration of the body. like in India, where they have Hindu practices of celebratory like festivals like Kumbh Mela. In the West, we've gone into this industrialized situation where sound like techno, hip hop, dubstep, you name it, that's the one part of society where people feel that they can just release and celebrate. And on the other hand, how we think about design, like the design of a space, the design of a club, the design of these headphones or your headphones or the screen, informs the kind of an invisible and intangible situation that's very coercive, actually. Democracy itself right now is in the 21st century, because of the relationship with algorithms and with so many of the computational aspects of a data-driven society. Those are things that have really, made people kind of go into a subconscious moment where they're just propelled by their need to fill their sort of, hunger that has been created for like advertising and new products and hyper consumption. People are, we're driving ourselves into extinction, basically. I mean, if you talk to any serious scientist right now, there's the Union of Concerned Scientists. They have this thing called the doomsday clock. And we're like a couple seconds away from doomsday at this point. I mean, it's really humanity. I mean, it's sorry to be a downer, but yeah, anyway, I do think that we can pull back from that if we change the mind, if we change behavior. And I'm a libertarian on some things, actually. When I say libertarian, I do think that given the tools for better critical thinking, I do trust my fellow human beings. The problem is that people have been conditioned by centuries, decades of hyper consumerism, capitalism, this notion of the scarcity economy that's driving everyone to just grab anything that they can get a hold of, and they think that makes their life better. And amusing enough, there's a lot of studies that show the more you consume, the less happy you are, and thus you're in a terrible cycle, like of a wealth accumulation, status accumulation. And people, they will spend their entire life trying to live like an Instagram feed, or just a lot of kids are growing up that way right now, which is like, or TikTok or Twitch and so on. Not that I'm against any of those platforms. It's just you need to be able to be careful and think clearly about how those relationships can transform the mind. I mean, amusing enough, there's a lot of studies that show they're in an attention economy now. Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, Instagram, every platform, they need engagement. And your brain actually produces certain neurochemicals like serotonin, dopamine. When you see that you've gotten a lot of clicks and likes, or when your package arrives from Amazon or whatever, that actually there's a physiological and neurochemical response. And people are studying that. And guess what? They're monetizing it like mad. I mean, we're right at the edge of this pandemic. And that technology class made more money during the pandemic than almost in human history. So,
yeah, I mean, I definitely, I relate, in that, I'm coming at it as an artist where most of my, my studio support came from working in the commercial realm, in advertising and agency work and stuff like that. And now, I'm hearing a lot about, it used to be about demographics, and now it's psychographics, where the individual is being broken down at almost a Freudian level, for consumerist sort of ends, and it's it's on the one hand, it's kind of fascinating when you're looking at it from this sort of external standpoint, but then from a personal standpoint, it's frightening. So it's strange, it's a strange world that we live in, for sure. One thing that I wanted to ask you, and this is something I've kind of been bringing up, in each of the interviews that I've been involved in, is so like we were introduced through by Christine Schuley, who's one of the artists that's going to be involved in the Southampton Arts Center show opening up next spring, that you'd expressed some interest in being involved in. And I just was interested in what your sort of interest or take on Techspressionism is, from the standpoint of an individual artist, because I think that what I find most interesting is like hearing what artists think about this idea from a first person standpoint, as I try to sort of develop it into something that gets brought into common usage, I think that each person that sort of hears this phrase or word or whatever you want to call it comes at it from a different starting point. So, I was curious what your thoughts are on it.
Sure. I mean, when you think about abstract expressionism, it's generally viewed as post-World War II. And the result of people like, I don't know, Willem de Kooning, Mark Rothko, Joan Mitchell, Jackson Pollock, and so on. The eerie thing about World War II and the regrouping after it is that the ideological framing of the Cold War set up a situation where you had Soviet realism on one hand, and then you had they needed to figure out a kind of a mere funhouse reflection of how the American art could actually be a countervailing ideology to that stuff. The communist ideology of realism, amusing enough, you would see like a worker in nature or people kind of celebrating the happiness of being in a communist rule. And, amusingly enough and strangely enough, the CIA helped sponsor a lot of early abstract expressionist exhibitions. So amusingly enough, the Cold War and the legacy of like kind of ideological framing really set the tone for, amusing enough, how we think about technology as well. So for example, during World War II, I argue this in my current book that I'm working on, that World War II was an information war. And so the legacy of encryption, cryptography, hackers, information network systems like ARPANET, that basically was a message system that was used for scientists, just in case they needed to be able to send messages, if there was a nuclear war, et cetera. The internet comes out of ARPANET. And in fact, the piece that I'm looking at presenting with your exhibition, we're going to have, it's called Quantopia, which stands for generally a quantified utopia. And amusingly enough, 1969 was when the first two hubs of the internet went live. It was between UCLA and the Stanford Research Institute. And so I tracked down the gentleman who wrote a lot of the early equations that set up what you call packet switching, which is what allows us to have this video call, for example. And his name is Dr. Leonard Kleinrock. He's a legendary figure in the history of the internet. And I wrote a symphony based around his work. And that was supposed to tour, but then the pandemic kicked in and et cetera. So we're just beginning to reboot all of that. And I've been enjoying just having a little bit of relaxed time. So when you think about abstract expressionism in the Cold War, the internet is a legacy of a major large-scale system that comes out of this information war. And the Soviet model, again, versus the late capitalist model, there's philosophers that inform my work, but mostly I have to admit Paul Virilio, Gilles Deleuze, and of course, Felix Guattari, who wrote a series of works called Mille Plateaux, which stands for 1,000 Plateaus. There's certain younger philosophers. Timothy Morton's book, Hyper Objects, is interesting. And many of the people involved with environmental issues who I think inform my practice are people like Bill McKibben, there's a couple of books called, After Earth, these are people who are investigating the deep structure of climate change. Elizabeth Kohlberg's book, on the Sixth Great Extinction. The fun part about post-World War II and your sense of abstract expressionism is transferring it into technology, is that human beings have this delusional sense of time frame. I went back to the term prototype. And amusingly enough, a human being on average now lives around 70 years old. And in that sense of time, since the Industrial Revolution, we've transformed the planet in ways that would have been unimaginable without major catastrophe, like volcanic action spewing huge clouds of ash into the air and causing a nuclear winter or something like that. And amusingly enough, the greenhouse gases and carbon that we've released, we've heated up the planet, that we're taking it back to some other crazy era that would have been like dinosaurs walking around and stuff like that. I mean, it's just mind-boggling how crazy our hyper-consumerism is driving the planet. And that's what I wrote about with my book about Antarctica. So like I said, I'm going to keep referring you guys to djspooky.com. If any of this, there's plenty of images that go with everything I'm talking about, a lot of research. I've worked with major scientists. Brian Greene, who wrote this book, The Universe, he wrote, that's one of his most famous books, but he's head of Columbia University's physics department. He wrote the introduction to my book. The current book, Digital Fictions, I'm going to be working with some pretty legendary figures from data analysis on over to kind of thinking about the role that a data-driven society can play with this idea of algorithmic realism. Instead of, when you think about abstract expressionism, my nickname now is like algorithmic realism. How do we think of the algorithms and computational models driving all of the current swirl of the metaverse of the information swirling around us right now? So,
did you want to share your screen and show a little bit of Quantopia, or anything else you wanted to share visually? And since you've been involved with the project, it actually kind of led me to rethink. We have a section on the website on Techspressionism called the Techspressionist Visual Artist Index, and I sort of eliminated the word visual from it recently. And your involvement made me kind of rethink, it's very limiting to think of it in that way. And certainly, a lot of the artists involved in the group work in a multimedia fashion where audio is a component, so I'm really interested in what you're doing with the Quantopia project and how that relates to Techspressionism. Okay, so let's just walk you through a couple things. And I'm just going to do a quick thing here. So this is the internet in 1969. The first two hubs went live in October. And by December, there was 2 more, so a total of 4. You can already see a sort of an exponential pattern going on here. 2 squared is 4, just for any math geeks out there. So by the time you start to think about the legacy of all these hubs and nodes, and of course now we would call them data centers, the hubs that make up the backbone of the internet, they're not the web. People tend to confuse the web and the internet. So Quantopia is occupies that kind of indeterminate space between the web and the internet. And as a composer, I'm very intrigued with this idea of logarithmic or algorithmic expression. And amusingly enough, the term algorithm is Arabic, and it comes from a very renowned Arabic mathematician. And I'm highly influenced by Archimedes as well, who is a very renowned Greek mathematician. And the fun part about this is Archimedes and Al-Khwarizmi. Amusingly and strangely enough, if you start to think about playfulness and reverence for numbers, the West is tricky. I mean, for example, we didn't have the concept of 0 for a long time, and the Greeks and Romans, there's a lot of history of the idea of 0. And the funny thing about zeros and ones is what makes up the entire internet now. And the history of 0 is really a kind of a legacy of conflict. In fact, for example, Fibonacci, who's wrote this book Liber Abaci, and amusingly enough, the Pope at that time banned the number 0 because they felt that it was the number of the devil and all sorts of tricks were going on. So imagine if you're a mathematician in the middle of the Cold War and you're commissioned to make this thing that you can have equations, be able to send messages over the internet with this thing called ARPANET that eventually, of course, became the internet. And you need to come up with better equations to send that data. That's what I'm talking about here. So what I ended up doing was, there's a small chorus you can't see in the background. It's the San Francisco Young Women's Choir. Regretfully, they're wearing black, but those billions of nodes you're seeing in the background, those were computed by Roger Antonsen, who's a very renowned Norwegian mathematician, and Greg Niemeyer, who's the head of the digital media department at UC Berkeley. We did a 3-way collaboration about math, music, and art. So the string quartet is playing. I'm sampling elements of the electronic motifs that are going back and forth with them.
And so Quantopia, again, stands for quantified utopia. And the pun here is that utopia comes from the ancient Greek term utopos, a place of no place. And of course, anyone out there, Plato in this area that writers like William Gibson, who coined the term cyberspace, we've gone down the rabbit hole. Like we're in Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland moment here. So I'm trying as much as possible to have a series of music works that are sort of an acoustic mirror that you hold up to. So all those dots are data center kind of metaphors. And as the concert goes on, you see billions and billions and billions of dots going around, mainly because they're related to the Internet of Things and the various objects that interact with data, mostly now mobile, of course. Most people in America have a cell phone. Your average cell phone has more computational power than almost all computers on the planet in 1969. So, and we're moving out of Moore's law of computing. All of these things are legacy issues that hang over my work. All right, so when I do all the graphics for my work, what I'll probably do with your exhibition is take Quantopia elements and then have them as visual motifs that you can remix and be able to have interact with the actual musical material. And again, this is a multi-dimensional project. It's not just visuals, it's not just music, but it's the Gestalt, as they say in German. The sum of the parts actually transcends the actual element, much like the internet. So with that said and done, to me at least, that's like the most current project, that and my book that I'm working on called Digital Fictions. Both of Quantopia is mostly finished. Digital Fictions is not. I'm working on it. It's taking a while. You know, time is elastic in the time of our pandemic. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. It shows you a little bit of elements. There's plenty more, but I'd like to leave the audience with a sensibility that they can kind of do a little bit of research, and we're all good.
Awesome. Awesome.
So yeah, it's almost 1:50. Do you have any like closing questions, comments?
I just wanted to say, thank you. I really appreciate your time and your involvement in the project. Kind of, I feel, has brought it to another level and made a lot of the people who are strictly visual artists who have been involved in Techspressionism really start to expand their notions of what the term could be applicable towards, including myself. And definitely have a lot of respect for your work, and also the mentality of not needing to live in a box, not needing to be in a category necessarily, and I think that that's a really it's a liberating sort of notion, as an artist, to be able to cross fields, cross disciplines, and not feel the need to do that, so I have a lot of respect for that. And yeah, just want to again say thank you for your time and participation. Look forward to sort of an ongoing collaboration in helping put this show together. I think it's going to be an awesome exhibition, and that's going to be opening up at Southampton Arts Center in April 2022. So
Yep.
yeah.
Well, Colin, congrats on your show. And yeah, I just want to say to everybody, my website's djspooky.com, has plenty of reference materials on it. And my books, there's usually, if you just Google Paul Miller, DJ Spooky, you'll see the books, or you can go to my website, djspooky.com/books. There's also djspooky.com/art, all of which has bits and pieces of all the various projects. So Colin, it was a pleasure. And, just everybody out there, wishing you strength in the middle of this pandemic, man. And I hope that we can all see each other in real time once this pandemic stuff we've gotten it under control. So Colin, thanks again,
awesome,
man.
Thank you. And I just wanted to say one last thing. Paul was also in our Techspressionist Salon meetup a couple of weeks ago. That's on the website as well, techspressionism.com/salon, and that was salon number 18. So he's on there and shared a bunch of his work on that recording as well. So Yeah, that's about it. And thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Okay.